In the summer of '96, the blackout was worse than the bad weather. The storm came from the lakefront, and the lightning that went with it slammed trees that downed power lines left and right. We were a small, poor town somewhere in the slush, sticks, and shit of the wet season. We only called ourselves a city to attract more citizens. There were 1,000 power problems in the area, and the rolling storms made repairs all the more difficult. Other customers came first. Watching the rain became a quickly learned hobby. There was nothing else to do other than read the old books in our attic. Water came down in even sheets, and it flooded the already decrepit lawns of our block with old bicycles, beer cans, and broken glass. Sometimes it was fun to watch the grass drown under the weight of it. Depending on the time of day and tide, most of the city was completely submerged. I was 25 years old, a young father with a toddler and wife who acted the same age. All of us lived with my parents then, on Bay Street. We argued a lot. Dad would say, "Is this covered by insurance?" And my wife, Mary, would tell him to ask them himself. There wasn't much money in the bank, and barely enough food left thawing out in the fridge. But we made ends meet. That's what Dad said. There was always someone out there who had it way worse. He was right. On the first night without power, the first child was taken. Ben Piccolo was 8 years old and our neighbor. If there was one word to describe the kid, it was moxie. Every snowstorm, Ben would gather up a crew of his classmates and go around the neighborhood offering to shovel snow for $20. Mrs. Piccolo had put Ben to bed at 10. He sat at the windowsill and watched the rain, like he had done any time there was a storm. The kids were hoping for school to be canceled, you see. There was never any reason to suspect anything suspicious or sinister in our small town. But the next morning, he was gone. The Piccolos, with the local police always in tow, did not understand it. Early the next morning, Mrs. Piccolo shouted her story in the streets, in the pouring rain, searching out any shopkeeper or poor passerby who would stop and listen to her sorrows. "Someone took my son," she would say, soaked to the bones and looking all the more psychotic. The cops did their best, but we were not a big town. In fact, referring to the police as a whole meant only 3 people in particular that lived within the limits. Their resources were stretched as it is, and with big maple trees blocking most of the roads, there wasn't a whole lot that could be done in the way of reinforcements. Only one thing was certain, and that was Ben had to be close. Even still, the only way out of the city was 60 miles of woods. "Are your babies safe?" Mrs. Piccolo would ask the town square in a haunting tone. "How do you know your baby is safe when my Ben is missing?" We didn't seriously ask ourselves that question until the second night when another kid was taken. We were officially flooded at that point. Transportation outside of the house was made impossible. The lake had overflowed, and that turned our shitty little city into the Venice of the Northeast. People shouted details of the case from window to window. Only folks that kept a canoe or something for the lake in their basement were able to leave their homes at all. The police had one, and the 3 of them patrolled the blocks in shifts. They claimed to be a mile down the road when Richard Renna went missing at 6 a.m. the second morning. Richard was 7. The rumor was that he got into an argument with his parents the night of his disappearance. It was the boy's birthday, and he wanted to go to a friend's house to play. But the treacherous conditions made it impossible for the Rennas to get him there safely, and they nixed the whole idea. Richard threw a tantrum and was sent up to bed at 10 to watch the storm from his windowsill. On the 3rd morning, the rain still came. Mr. and Mrs. Renna joined the Piccolos in their campaigns to find their children. The whole thing was an absurdity. 4 parents stuck together on one canoe, while the police waddled along in another. My wife nagged me incessantly to join them. Soon, my mother was in on the gig, and she convinced my father to take the old single engine out of the shed. In retrospect, I should have stayed home and protected my son. Before we left that night, we had a very bad fight. Matthew wanted to play out in the storm. He had never seen the water stacked up so high. It was like a swimming pool sitting in our backyard. At first, Mary was going to let him off easy. She only told the kid she didn't want him tracking mud in the house. But after a tantrum, she screamed at him, really laying in all the stress of the damage and shit the weather had caused our already cash-strapped small family. She sent him to bed early, at 6, and stayed downstairs with my mom playing Pinochle or some shit. I didn't say a thing. The rain was at its worst on the third night. It was as if the storm was circling us. The power company promised to have someone there in the morning. Road crews had made their way through the biggest of maples, blocking the main road, but had not managed to move it. The latest wave of wind had sent them home early, and as dark fell on the third night, we were still left without electricity. At 7, the 3 of our canoes converged in the town square. My father and I were in one, the parents overcrowded into another, and all 3 policemen in the last. They were grateful for the help and set up a strategy where each of us would patrol the 3 neighborhoods in the city. Each group got a radio so they could call for backup if they needed it. Our boat took Bay Street, the police were on Meulen, and the parents took Broad. Most of the night and early morning was spent sitting and waiting. The water was only 3 or 4 feet deep in most parts, but it still managed to conceal a whole lot of sins. To pass the hours, I would sit and watch as buckets of it dropped, and wondered what diseases, branches, or electrical shocks sat underneath. We were not seasoned seamen, so it was not exactly a shock that we burned through our boat fuel in the first few hours. We argued about that quietly for the better part of an hour. But we had managed to pack a couple paddles, and with the water as shallow as it was, were able to push off the concrete and gravel streets underneath fairly easily. It was on our second round with the paddles that we heard the first sounds, sharply at 6 a.m. Tap, tap, tap then. Come out, Maddie. The voice was hollow. It had to be from a few houses away. But even through the horrible, howling wind, I heard that motherfucker say the name of my son. I was hysterical. The next few seconds were critical. I knew that ahead of everything else. The water was cold, but not cold enough to freeze. It was shallow, but not shallow enough to stand. My father didn't stop me when I started to swim. The last thing he said before I rounded the corner of Bay Street was to the radio. "There's been a sighting." I saw him before my father. Standing at the peak of a broad, balanced canoe was a man dressed neatly in a black mask, hood, and robes. He looked relaxed, even in the rain, with a hand rested on his hip while he tapped patiently on the glass window of my house. Seated with their legs crossed in the back of the canoe were both boys, Brian Piccolo and Richard Renna. But they were asleep, or at least they were not moving. I shouted to them from down the block, but the lapping, putrid water and rain got in my mouth and made me gag. My voice was indistinguishable from the sapping of trees in the wind. I watched helplessly when the windowsill of my home on Bay Street opened up wide. In a second, I saw my son Matt lean outside to see what was happening. As if on response to the open window, the hooded figure kicked into life and gestured widely to the seated children behind him, like a showman thanking his orchestra. They didn't move, confirming my suspicion that they were asleep. Then the man raised a gloved hand with elongated and curved endings that suggested unkempt nails and gestured with his fingers. 1, 2, 3. And then he pointed at Matt. It was like a scene from a play. Matthew nodded emphatically and started to climb from the windowsill, shimmying his little body through the break with ease. I screamed through the water, jumping and waving and doing anything I could to push myself further through the oncoming waves. In the hysteria, my leg caught the bumper of an old Buick. Blood started to fill the water around me. But I kept screaming, It seemed the sound of my voice had no effect on any of them. They were entranced, like they were acting out their lines, and I was just the observant in the theater. Matthew got into the boat slowly, moving his little legs over the older, unmoving children already seated. He nearly fell overboard when he did, but the hooded figure reached out an arm and caught him in a dramatically overprotective way. When Matthew got to the back of the boat, he plopped himself down on the final seat and sat with his legs crossed. On cue, the man turned his back to the front of the 6-foot canoe and raised both his arms. The boat started to move. I lost control of any control left in that moment. I splashed and screamed, making any noises that could possibly draw attention to myself and keep them in the area. The entire thing felt like an eternity, but had only lasted a couple minutes. The man standing on top of the small boat kept his back turned and arms up through it all. Their boat moved effortlessly through the floodwater, as if guided by some unattached or out-of-sight and soundless engine. In moments, they were 100 yards away and out into the woods. Some time after that, I heard the panicked paddles of my father and the whinnying engine of the police boat in the distance. Before I lost consciousness, I could have sworn my son turned back. When he did, his eyes were red. The doctors and police have since assured me the red eyes were a symptom of my sickness at the time. I woke up in a hospital bed 2 days after the storm. In addition to the massive blood loss, the exposure to the lake water gave me sepsis, which needed to be treated out of town. They kept me sedated for my own safety. By the time I was conscious, the floodwater had receded, leaving the town's filth waterlogged and on full display. But nobody ever found our boys. Today is the 22nd anniversary of his disappearance, and I am still looking for my son, Matthew. The Piccolos, Rennas, and myself have organized a worldwide organization responsible for tracking similar abductions. We are asking folks with similar stories to please come forward without fear of reprisal. Thank you. Lately, I am having blackouts. I wake up in strange places, and my body feels sore. Sometimes my clothes are stained with blood. Sometimes they are torn apart. I can't remember what happened to me, where I've been, what I've said. I have no memories at all. It's strange. It only started recently, I think 3 months ago. It started when my mother died. I think it affected me more than I'd like to admit. I'm not really a talker, you see. I'm more comfortable with keeping things to myself. That's why I haven't told my girlfriend about these blackouts. Why should I? There is nothing to worry about. It's not like it is dangerous. Sure, there is sometimes blood and my clothes are damaged, but I must have fallen. I'm clumsy after all. Everyone knows that. Yet I can't shake this strange feeling. The feeling that something has happened, or that something is wrong. Every time I am close to figuring it out, everything becomes black again. Last week I was having a bad day, you know, when everything annoys you, or people are being just so rude. I was at work, and there was this one customer who just kept staring at me, and it was getting on my nerves. I asked if he wanted to order another round, since his beer glass was empty. Perhaps I noticed it too late, and he was annoyed with me. He yelled at me that I should mind my own business, and something snapped. It reminded me of how my mother would yell at me, how I was a fuck-up, how she wished she never gave birth to me. It all became black just like back then. When I woke up, the bar was empty, and there were some glass pieces scattered around the floor. It was such a mess. There was also a puddle of some red fluid on the ground. I think it was red wine. Couldn't be something else, right? Right. On the news, they are talking about a serial killer. Bodies have been discovered spread across the city. They say they were cut up pretty bad. I'm worried about my girlfriend. I must warn her not to go out alone after dark. That person must be very dangerous. I must protect her. That's why I've called her over to my place, to keep an eye on her, and of course, I like being with her. But then, she just kept asking about my mom. that she was worried about her since she haven't heard back from her, how they were supposed to go shopping together. Why did she ask? Why couldn't she just mind her own business? She got mad first, because apparently I was behaving strange, and she didn't like I wasn't answering her. Then she got worried, because I was looking a little weird at her. Then she got scared because my voice and face were changing. What happened after that, I can't remember, because once again my vision became blurry and filled with darkness. She looks so pretty right now. Her blonde hair spread out on the floor, shining so pretty in the light. Her blue eyes staring right at me, like she's looking into another world. Her skin is so soft and pale. She reminds me of Snow White. I'm a bit worried about her stomach. Her blouse is covered in red. Well, she always liked her red wine a bit too much, but that's okay. It's funny, I can't remember that she fell asleep after our argument. I'm sure we figured it out, that we are forever together. She must be sleeping, right? Right? I really can't sleep, even if there's a small amount of light. I have blackout blinds and have tinted the windows in my bedroom, so not even the brightest moonlight is allowed in. I make sure that I fill the cracks under and around my door every night to stop anything residual from creeping in. I do have a sleeping mask, 2 in fact. I moved my bed so that I can sleep facing the darkest corner I can find. However, it isn't much of the light itself, but what I can see in it. I used to enjoy seeing the strange family of 4 that inhabited the dim-lit spaces of my room, just barely visible in my peripheral. I say family loosely. I can only assume. There are 2 taller ones, and there are 2 smaller ones, and they're always together. They have no features and are oddly 2-dimensional looking. It's almost as if someone took pale, white, shadeless cartoon drawings off of a paper and set them up in different positions. In the empty space between my bed and my door, they'd spend their nights frozen in a certain way. I could move around them, get up and close, pretend to be with them, etc., and they wouldn't move. Their void-filled eyes never moved from a spot, and their mouthless expressions never changed. And so I'd watch them before I go to sleep. They would play games, and everything they interacted with would also be in the same visual style, pale white and unmoving. One night they played hide and seek. Another, it looked like large Jenga. I even saw them play soccer, with the parents being the goalies. They were simple, still images that I found amusing. Until one night one of the smaller ones looked at me. They had never done this, not any of them. Sometimes their heads would be turned towards my direction, my bed, but I never felt like I was being stared at. The family was having a tea party, and the other 3 were either looking at each other or the props. But this one, with teacup in hand, had its head pointed directly towards where I sleep. I couldn't help but stare back, perplexed. It felt like hours, but after a few seconds passed by, a chill spread throughout my body, and I instinctually reached to turn on the light. They all disappeared, and I slept with it on. Despite losing some sleep, I kept the light on for the rest of the week. Something deep inside of me had a visceral reaction to being watched. It worked, until it didn't. The light from my lamp soon stopped being a complete deterrent. I was ready to bed when I saw the outline of the family again, engrossed in a game of poker. Half of them were, at least. Both of the smaller ones now stared in my direction, with what I thought to be a thin black smile across their faces. A larger one was taking the pot, while the other palmed its face in sadness, both still frozen. That night, I turned my lamp off again, to see if anything would change, to hope that they would disappear. Horribly, the one thing that did change was that I saw a single, glowing red dot out of the corner of the palm of the taller one, staring directly at me. And so I sleep, in the absolute darkness. Nothing has happened, so I assume I made the right choice. I dared not see what would happen if I let them notice me more. That is why darkness is my friend. A place where I can hide, but only if it is black as pitch.